Back in November 2019, the UFC introduced the BMF title to try to sell to the consumer that Nate Diaz and Jorge Masvidal deserved to headline UFC 244 at Madison Square Garden. Here we are 6.5 years later, and the title is still in rotation, but it is now representing the main event for UFC 326 as BMF champion Max Holloway rematches Charles do Bronx Oliveira. Do we really need a silver title that doesn't really have much meaning to it on the line to justify why we should watch this banger of a fight? Probably not, but for some reason the UFC is choosing to keep it around, and apparently that will be enough to bring in the mainstream viewer to be like, hey, there is a title on the line. It may not be gold, and it may not include the best fighter in that division, but there's still a belt on the line. So there's got to be some sort of value in this matchup. How about the fact that these two guys are the most violent fighters at the lightweight division, and they have a little bit of a storied past together, so why not just lean on that to sell this fight? The hardcore fans know that this fight will be a banger, title or not, and I can't wait to get into it and see how it transpires in their second meeting. Thus, it is time to lock in for the UFC 326 breakdowns. Kicking off the card, we have light heavyweights Luke Fernandez coming in at -220, going up against veteran Rodolfo Bellato, who comes in at +185. Now, starting off on the Fernandez side of things, he probably had the easiest path to the UFC, especially with the opponent they gave him on the Contender Series, a fight in which he came in as a -1,000 favorite, and it only took him 15 seconds to knock his opponent out and secure that UFC contract. Now, this Dante Rivera BJJ product is 6-0 as a pro. He also went 6-0 as an amateur, and he's done a great job in terms of asserting his dominance over there at CFFC, where he captured their light heavyweight title, defended a few times, and eventually got that Contender Series opportunity to get to the biggest stage in the world. He usually comes from a grapple-heavy approach, likes to take his opponents to the ground and try to smother them that way, or at least that was his approach on the amateur scene. But once he became a pro, he started to rely on his hands a little bit more, and that's now produced many knockouts for him as a professional. He did go back to his grappling roots against Christian Edwards in his last CFFC matchup to try to grind out that performance. Edwards, on paper, probably a better striker, so Fernandez knew for him to secure that win, it was going to have to be a little bit more grindy and a little bit more of a grappling approach rather than letting his hands go and try to come through with a highlight reel knockout. But he could easily rely on his hands against his last opponent, which is why he came out with the win so quickly. Again, more of a grappler than a striker, and I think it's just going to be a matter of time before he gets that reality check that he still needs to improve his striking game, and it could potentially come this weekend as he goes up against the tough, rugged, and veteran style of Rodolfo Bellato. Now, Bellato is coming off of a decision loss against Navajo Sterling, who is a very educated striker, but even Sterling had to go into his full bag of martial arts skills to try to pull off the win against Bellato. We saw Sterling get the takedown in the second round, grind out a few minutes there, but eventually Bellato got back to his feet and tried to get some respect back with his striking. What has caused Bellato issues in the past are grapple-heavy fighters, but we've seen in certain fights that he can stop that approach and then get to a striking game where he often has an advantage over his opponents. He's very tough. He's very durable. He's had a couple weird fights over his last couple of fights, but still very deserving of being a guy that can really separate the prospects from guys that actually deserve to be ranked in the light heavyweight division. High level durability, like I said, nasty striking and knockout power that he can rely on if he needs to. But again, maybe not a guy that's going to get into championship contention. Now here against Luke Fernandez, this is an interesting fight. You got the prospect in Fernandez coming in as a heavy favorite, something we often see with guys coming off the Contender Series, but Bellato is going to be the toughest challenge of Fernandez's career. I'm assuming this is a fight where Fernandez is going to go back to his grappling to try to grind Bellato out and keep Bellato away from the striking advantage the Brazilian holds, but I think Fernandez will struggle in doing so. At +185, I think it's tough to pass up Bellato in the spot. This is a great test for Fernandez, and one that I think he's going to struggle mightily to pass. And I think that will lead to Bellato stuffing most of the grappling attempts of Fernandez and then landing more damage on the feet to win this fight on the scorecards. I see the fight goes to decision, sits around plus 300. And considering the amount of grappling I'm expecting to take place in this matchup, I can see this fight hitting the scorecards. So even if you don't like Bellato as the underdog play, maybe considering that fight to go to decision would be up your alley a little bit more. But I'm going to go Bellato here, and I think he wins this fight on the scorecards. Next up, we got a featherweight clash here between Jung Lee, who comes in at minus 250, going up against Gaston Bolanos, who comes in at plus 210. Now, Lee is stepping in on short notice for fellow countryman Ju Sang Yu, who was forced out of this matchup due to injury. And now Lee is looking to snap a 2-fight losing streak to try to get back into the win column. That first loss came at the hands of Haider Emil in a matchup that was fought at a frantic pace and only lasted about 65 seconds. We saw Lee land some good shots and even snap the head back of Emil a few times, so I don't rag on him too much in terms of engaging in that pocket exchange with Emil. Unfortunately for him, that's a spot where you flip a coin and whoever's turn ends up there will more than likely get the win. And unfortunately for Lee, it was Emil who had landed the seminal blow to get that finish in 65 seconds. Then Lee tried bouncing back in his next matchup against Daniel Santos, a fight that many expected to play out in the striking realm, and I really thought the technical advantages of Lee would lead to him winning that fight. Unfortunately, Santos had other plans. Santos mixed up the game very well, landed several takedowns to really grind Lee out and keep him on his back, and I don't think Lee was really expecting that type of approach from Wily Cat. Now Lee, still a guy with a ton of potential, 30 years old, very good striking, good technique, stinging power, and does have a decently active guard off of his back, but grappling is often where opponents look to take him to try to muzzle and contain the style that he brings to the table. Now he's going up against Gaston Bolanos, who's coming off of a submission loss to Kwang Lee. Now before that, he did pick up a decision win over Cortavius Romius, where we saw him start to flex his grappling muscles a bit. He is more of a striker, flashy combinations and spinning stuff and flying stuff, but in that Romius fight, we saw him get taken down at the starting of each round, but he showed off his grappling skills by pulling off reversos and getting some good control time of his own to steal rounds back in his favor and ultimately get the win on the scorecards. Unfortunately, he couldn't do that against Kwang Lee, who did a great job in terms of getting him to the ground almost immediately in the first round, riding that back position, not letting go of the body lock at all, and that eventually led to him getting that submission in the second round when Bolanos couldn't have much success in terms of working back to his feet. And that's kind of the hole that's been in Bolanos' game throughout his mixed martial arts career. I thought his performance against Marcus McGee was a flat performance and not a good representation of what Bolanos normally brings to the table, and I think that's why we saw him look even better against Romius. This is a fight here, though, against Jung Lee, where we'll probably see Bolanos get to flex those striking skills a little bit more. I'd be surprised if Lee looks to chase a grapple-heavy approach similar to what Kwang Lee did. I'm expecting him to mix it in here and there, but not be as dead set on keeping Bolanos on his back. I expect this to be a little bit more of a competitive striking battle, so to see Lee all the way up at minus 250 is a little surprising to me. I'm expecting this to be a little bit more competitive, and that leads me to believe that the public probably sees it the same way, so we'll probably see some love on Bolanos start to come in throughout fight week. But even with that said, I am not privy on taking that shot on Bolanos. He has shown himself to be flat in certain spots, and I think Lee is a better striker in terms of establishing his dominance, his speed, his power, his straight shots down the pipe, and I think that will allow him to land better shots here against Bolanos and eventually win this fight on the scorecards. Another spot where the over is whispering in my ear a little bit. I think that's at a decent plus money spot as well, but I'm thinking Lee ends up outstriking Bolanos and winning this fight on the scorecards. Next up, in the light heavyweight division, we have the UFC debut of Rafael Tobias, who comes in at minus 220. He takes on the slumping Dr. Nurgozhay, who comes in at plus 185. Now, Tobias probably could have been in the UFC a lot sooner, but a July 2023 loss at the hands of Miguel Porto put Tobias on the back burner a little bit, but he's been able to put up a solid winning streak, which earned him his shot on the Contender Series this past season, and he made short work of an opponent that probably didn't even deserve that opportunity to begin with. Tobias went into his grappling bag and eventually sunk in the rear naked choke to get the tap over his opponent. Tobias, Very skilled and solid fighter. Good striking for a guy that normally relies on his grappling. And I think he learned a lot from that loss to Miguel Porto in terms of having a solid striking defense game so he doesn't get caught with anything big again. And that was a fight, the one that he lost, where he was controlling the majority of it until he got clipped in the opening minutes of round 2 to eventually get knocked out there. But this guy's very skilled, very well trained. He trains under Jennifer Maia's husband, Monstro Maia, I believe his name is. But they have this kid very much ready to go to be an impact in the UFC. He's very skilled. Like I said, tight, crisp striking, good knockout power as well. But if he really wants to play it safe, he can normally take fights to the ground and establish his BJJ brown belt there, and that usually leads to him finding a finish. Now he's going up against Dr. Nurgozhay, who I'll admit has not really fleshed out into being the type of fighter I expected him to be, especially after coming off the Contender Series the way that he did. He was 10-0 coming into the UFC, finishing the majority of his opponents, showcasing a good mix of smothering grappling, but also an effective striking game so he can get opponents out of there and keep them on the defensive. But he's looked flat in the UFC so far, from getting outstruck by Brundage and Ribeiro and eventually getting submitted by him when Nurgozhay finally got to his grappling game, to being dropped by Uran Satibaldiev and then eventually getting Ezekiel choked to be forced to tap in that matchup. He's really not, the fighter that I thought he was. He's very hesitant on the feet, makes a lot of mistakes in the striking realm. The naked lead uppercut that he tried to throw against Satibaldiev that got him dropped and eventually club and sub there. Not a good look, right? This guy's better than what we've seen in the UFC, but maybe he's not able to rise to the occasion and compete at this type of level or in front of this type of platform. At his best, he has smothering grappling, good top pressure, good top game, good ground and pound as well, but he just has not been able to show it as of late. Now, Tobias finds himself in a similar position to the first fight of the night, where he's coming in as a -220 favorite, coming off the Contender Series against a guy who's already had a few UFC matchups. However, I believe Tobias is a little bit more ready for this style of fighting. I think Nurgozhay might look to get to the grappling game, but I think Tobias will have good enough takedown defense, but also good enough defensive grappling to fend that off from Nurgozhay. On the feet, I think Tobias is a little bit cleaner. Nurgozhay is a little bit sloppy at times, leaves himself open to get clipped, and that's where I think Tobias could potentially have some success as well. Am I confident to the point of going -220 deep in Tobias? Probably not. I had some pretty good confidence in Nurgozhay in his first 2 UFC matchups, and he let me down. But I'm not willing to completely write him off to the point of fading him with the -220 favorite. There are avenues for him to win this matchup and pull off the upset. I just don't see them panning out, especially if we get the type of Nurgozhay that we've been seeing in his last 2 matchups. I thought the Satibaldiev fight probably would have been a great bounce-back opportunity for him going up against a guy as reckless as Satibaldiev, but he's not fighting a reckless fighter here in Tobias. He's fighting a calm, calculated guy who's going to take advantage of the holes in Nurgozhay's game, and I think that will eventually lead to Tobias getting that submission victory. Maybe I would hone in on the submission prop more than the chalky money line, but I still expect Tobias to get his hand raised, and like I said, I think it comes by submission. Moving over to the flyweight division now, we got Sumudaerji coming in at -270, going up against Jesus Aguilar, who comes in at +230. Now, Sumudaerji is starting to put that 3-fight losing streak in his rearview mirror. He's coming off of back-to-back victories over Mitch Raposo, which was a weird split decision. I thought it was clear that he won that fight, even though I had a little bit of confidence on the Raposo side. And then last time, he put on a clean performance against Kevin Borjas in a fight where he was picking apart Borjas from distance. It forced Borjas to get to his grappling game, but Sumudaerji shut that down completely and outdamaged him and pretty much swept him on the scorecards. That's Sumudaerji at his best. He is often going to be fighting guys that are going to try to take him to the ground and keep him away from his striking finesse. This guy does a great job in terms of keeping his range, striking opponents down the pipe, sticking and moving, and then cutting off on angles, so it's hard for grapplers to level change and get in on his hips cleanly. He's getting better at defending that. Obviously, Raposo was trying to get him to the ground, kind of struggled to do so and try to be successful with it. And Sumudaerji is showing, even at 30 years old, that he continues to get better through his career. He's coming into his 26th pro fight this weekend as he goes up against Jesus Aguilar, a guy that a lot of people are kind of mystified as to why he still has a UFC spot. But he is 4-2 through his 6 fights with the promotion. But this is a guy that overperforms in certain spots, right? There's been a few fights where he's pulled off the upset, like Mateusz Mendonça, even the Luis Garul fight. But it's that power that he brings to the table that makes it hard for people to get a beat on him. He also has a nasty guillotine, which he's caught in 5 of his 12 victims of, including Stuart Nickel, which was the second last win that he has on his record. His last loss came at the hands of Rafael Estevam, who did a great job in terms of taking Aguilar to the ground, getting those control positions, grinding out those first 2 rounds. And even though Aguilar had some good success in the 3rd round, it was not enough to outdo what Estevam was able to do in the first 10 minutes. Last time around against Luis Garul, he landed big shots in the 1st round to win that round. 2nd round, a little bit more of a toss-up, but I thought Garul won that round. And the 3rd round, kind of close outside of Aguilar, rocking and wobbling Garul in the opening minute of that round, and I think that was the deciding factor. What Aguilar does best is crash the pocket with big shots to either drop his opponents, rock his opponents, or get the respect from them so that he can dictate the pace and move forward and throw his shots at will. He usually brings out bad takedown attempts from his opponents, which is when he jumps on that guillotine, which, like I said, 5 of his 12 wins have come by that method, and he's usually pretty good in terms of establishing that choke and forcing his opponents to tap out from it. Now, here against Sumudaerji, I feel like we're going to see Aguilar try to get to his game of just crashing the pocket with big strikes. After a few exchanges, though, I think he's going to start to realize that Sumudaerji is a far superior striker, and he's going to be able to counter Aguilar effectively, sticking and moving, utilizing that jab to keep Aguilar at distance. I think that's going to cause Aguilar a ton of issues. In terms of a reach here, you got Sumudaerji with a 10-inch reach advantage as well as a 4-inch height advantage, and I think he's going to try to exaggerate that to the best of his ability in the stand-up round. Then I think it's just a matter of time before Aguilar looks to start taking this fight to the ground. Unfortunately, I don't think he has a good enough wrestling game to take advantage of that part against Sumudaerji here. I think Sumudaerji will, there will be a few minutes spent up against the cage with Aguilar working for takedowns, but I think we'll see Sumudaerji showcase good takedown defense. I think he'll be able to work immediately back to his feet. I'm expecting a lot of these takedowns to take place up against the cage, and from there, that's where Sumudaerji will utilize that wall walk to get back to his feet, and then he starts attacking the body lock, the hands, and then gets back out into distance where he can get back to his handiwork of landing his better strikes. So I think Sumudaerji wins here. I think he picks apart Aguilar pretty convincingly. I think he wins on the scorecards. I think Aguilar is very hard to put away. So I think Sumudaerji by decision at plus 210, not a bad spot. And I also wouldn't mind Sumudaerji as a parlay piece at this minus 270 line. So I'm going to go Sumudaerji and Sumudaerji by decision. Sticking with the flyweight division, we're going to go over to this matchup between Cody Durden, who comes in at plus 125, going up against Nurgozhay Tumendemberel, who comes in at minus 145. Now, Durden is looking to snap this 3-fight losing streak that he's on, as he's come up short against eventual champion Joshua Van, who was able to stop his takedowns and box him up on the feet, losing to Jose Ochoa, who was able to knock him out in the 2nd round. And then the Alan Nascimento fight, where Nascimento pulled off a comeback submission victory after club and subbing Durden. Now, I want to hone in on that Nascimento fight for Durden, because that fight showcased solid improvements in Durden's striking game, but more so the confidence in his striking game to go out there and put that pace and pressure on Nascimento. Now, Durden comes from a wrestling background, so you often look to see him take opponents to the ground and try to smother them there, look for submission opportunities or ground and pound spots for him. But Nascimento, high-level BJJ black belt, I'm assuming Durden wanted to utilize his grappling defensively so he can try to bang on Nascimento with his power. And he was doing pretty well for about 8 minutes. As a plus 170 dog, he was looking like the favorite. Unfortunately, he eventually got caught with a counter down the pipe that seemed to wobble Durden, and Durden's instincts kicked in at that moment, got back to his wrestling, went for a takedown, and that allowed Nascimento to sink in. I believe it was an anaconda choke, and that forced Durden to tap. Now, Durden did try fighting out of the submission. I'll give him credit for that. Unfortunately, he was just put in a very bad position up against the cage where it was very hard for him to roll out of that spot. He utilized the cage, tried to get to a better position, but by the time he was clear of the cage, the choke was already too deep. It was already being held for too long, and he was forced to tap. So I'll give Durden credit. This guy is a warrior. This guy is a tough out. He's always going to bring the pressure. He's always going to bring the power, and he can lean on his wrestling when he needs to. But I think his last couple of fights have shown what his ceiling is. This is a guy I expect, even if he goes on a 4-fight losing streak, that the UFC will decide to keep around because of the action-heavy fights that he brings whenever he steps inside the cage. And action is exactly what he is going to get as he goes up against Mongolian prospect Nurgozhay Tumendemberel, who is looking to build upon his submission victory over Terence Sadern from back in August. Now, Tumendemberel is a guy that I've faded twice, I believe both times as lock of the night plays, which means I am 1-1 against him. The first time we went with Carlos Hernandez, who I expected to evade the power punching of Tumendemberel and eventually utilize his grappling advantage to kind of to muzzle the Mongolian fighter. But Tumendemberel definitely showed much more resistance than I was expecting him to, and did not spend as much time on the ground as I thought he was going to. He was able to work back to his feet, and he was able to threaten Hernandez time and time again with the power that he brings. And then the Terence Sadern fight. He obviously lost the Hernandez fight by split decision. Again, played out much closer than I thought, but I was still happy to cash the lock of the night ticket there. But I thought Terence Sadern was going to be able to be a little bit more safer than Hernandez. I thought Sadern was going to be a crisper striker, and I thought his defensive grappling would be good enough, and his offensive grappling would have been good enough to put Tumendemberel in those bad positions. Now, unfortunately, Sadern just seemed muzzled by the power that was coming back his way, and then he shot in for a bad takedown attempt, and Tumendemberel showed off his submission game, which a lot of people seem to overlook, right? They kind of just see him as a guy that walks opponents down, throws big, reckless shots, and tries to knock his opponents out, but 2/3 of his wins have come by submission. I believe 6 of his 9 wins have come by submission, including that nasty anaconda choke that he got against Terence Sadern, putting Sadern away and putting him to sleep completely. Very, very impressive performance there by the Mongolian fighter. Throws with a lot of power, has crazy good durability. His defensive grappling is improving at a very solid rate, and I think that's going to make him go from being a dark horse to a guy that a lot of people will start to take notice of. Now, this will easily be his toughest matchup to date, going up against a guy like Cody Durden. Durden has fought the best and the worst of the flyweight division since joining the promotion back in 2020, and I'm sure he's going to go to his grappling here to try to get the better of Tumendemberel. Unfortunately, I think Tumendemberel can stop the grappling. I think he'll be able to work back to his feet after inevitably being taken down, and from there he can either threaten with submissions after Durden starts shooting bad takedown attempts, or he starts getting the respect of Durden when he starts throwing back with the heat that we know he can throw back with. So I don't really know what the approach here is from Durden. Probably wrestling, right? He's going to look to try to stay away from the power of Tumendemberel, but as we've seen, the Mongolian fighter has done a great job in terms of working on his get-ups and then getting back on the pace and pressure, which often drowns his opponents. The spot that I like most in this matchup is the under 2.5. It's around the same as the money line on Tumendemberel. I'm expecting no matter who wins to end up getting the finish, whether it's Durden by submission or even Durden landing a big shot on the feet. As we know, the confidence in his striking is definitely getting up there. Or it's Tumendemberel landing the big shot and either getting a club and sub or just a straight up knockout, because we know he has the power in his hands as well. So I like the under 2.5 the most. I'm going to go with the Mongolian fighter. Again, I've faded him with lock of the night plays in his last 2 matchups, but I think this is going to be a tough one for Durden to overcome, considering the danger that the Mongolian fighter presents. So give me Tumendemberel. I'm going to say by knockout, but he could get a club and sub as easily as well. But I'll go Tumendemberel inside the distance. All right, moving over to this featherweight matchup, we got Ricky Turcios coming in at plus 160, going up against Alberto Montes, who comes in at minus 185. Now, Turcios won Ultimate Fighter 29 back in 2021, but has only 1-3 in the UFC since that show finished up. His only win is against Kevin Natividad by split decision, and he was actually scheduled to fight earlier this year against Cameron Smotherman back in January, but we all remember what happened with Smotherman at the weigh-ins, falling face first and ultimately getting that fight canceled. Now Turcios going up a weight class here, and I think that's more so to do with him just trying to make use of his last training camp and trying to get a fight in still, and I expect him to go back to 135 pounds after this matchup completes, if he's at least able to get his hand raised here. Turcios is one of the more awkward and unorthodox fighters on the roster, from his flashy and weird striking game to his scrambling style, which makes it very hard for a lot of opponents to get a hold of him and contain him. The only guy that's been able to submit him was Raul Rosas Jr., who we'll be talking about later on in this card. But Turcios was making it very hard on Rosas in that first round to establish a dominant position. Unfortunately, Rosas eventually caught up to him in the second round and was able to choke him out. Last time around, though, Turcios came up short against Bernardo Sopai in a fight that showcased the downside of Turcios' game. Even though he has high output and high volume, he's very inaccurate with how he throws his shots, and that often leads to him having fights where he throws 20% accuracy, 30% accuracy, because his opponents can see his shots come in and evade them. But he can utilize that style to get the better of fighters that are more uncomfortable in the striking realm. Sopai is a solid striker. He was able to throw his shots, land big shots, and that was enough for him to get the win there. But against certain other opponents, right, the Kevin Natividads, even on the show, Turcios fought some decent opposition in Dan Argueta and even Ludovic Sholinian, and he was able to outpoint those guys and win those fights on the scorecards. I was going up against Alberto Montes, who earned his contract through the Contender Series back in 2024. So he was scheduled to make his debut back in April. Unfortunately, a rib injury a few weeks before the fight pulled him out of that matchup, and now he gets his UFC debut a year and a half after earning his contract through the Contender Series. He went up against Carlos Calderon that night, where it was a matchup that was highly reliant on Montes snatching up that anaconda or Darce choke and trying to force the tap. Calderon was able to work out of it in the first round, but unfortunately Montes got that nasty position in the second round, and Calderon was forced to tap that in that round. That is often the way Montes looks to get his wins. 4 of his wins have come with that front choke series, whether it's the Darce choke or the anaconda choke, because he's trying to exaggerate that long, lanky frame that he has, and he has a good frame to try to apply that choke, and it seems like he has a nasty squeeze to go with it as well. He has had some bad injuries in the past that have kept him out for long periods of time. There was that ACL injury that he had in 2019, 2020. He did also have to sit out of competition after his lone defeat to Ira Lukowski, where he got knocked out in the second round of that fight. He sat on the sidelines, I believe, for 2 years, maybe a year and a half to 2 years, and then eventually came back to those 3 straight wins to get himself into the UFC. He's also one of the few guys that are still repping the Goat Shed banner, a gym that was seemingly picking up some steam a few years ago, but a lot of those fighters jetting from that gym, going to American Top Team or other gyms in that Florida area. Montes, again, slick grappler, like I said, good front choke series. His striking game is a lot of flashy kicks. He doesn't seem to be the most comfortable there because he's just trying to throw big shots to either hurt his opponents or disguise level changes behind it. But I'm very skeptical of whether he is a UFC level fighter or not, especially with how much he often sells out for that front choke. And if he can't get it, that's a quick way to burn your arms out and burn your gas tank out, and that could really come back to bite him in the ass. Now, that's going to be tested here against Ricky Turcios, who is a BJJ black belt and only been submitted once in his career. And like I said, that was against Raul Rosas Jr., who I rate a much higher grappler than Alberto Montes. On the feet, I think Turcios could have better success by landing more damage, or at least landing more output and countering the flashy kicking game of Montes. I think Montes is going to look to get this to the ground and try to get to his choke game, but I think we'll see Turcios be scrambly enough to keep Montes from getting to a dominant enough position. And I think that will eventually lead to Turcios just landing a little bit more effective damage in the striking realm. Hopefully he's a little bit more accurate with this this time around, but he's not fighting a confident striker, which I think helps his chances of being the more effective striker in this matchup. So I'm going to go Turcios here. I'm not a big Turcios fan at all, but seeing how this fight is lined and seeing how I think it's going to play out, I think he ends up landing a more effective damage, survives the grappling of Montes, and eventually wins this fight on the scorecards, pulling off the upset as a plus 160 underdog. All right, moving over to the middleweight division now. We got Dante Johnson coming in at minus 650, going up against Cody Brundage, who comes in at plus 475. Now, Dante Johnson is 7-0. Add that 7th win to his record in his UFC debut back in November, where he was able to get a second-round submission victory over Cedric Dumas. Now, that was a fight where we saw Johnson go into the second round for the first time in his career, and his cardio looked fine. It seemed like he dealt with the grappling onslaught of Dumas early pretty well. There was a moment where he was, on his knees alongside the cage defending the grappling of Dumas, and his coach was just telling him to get up, and Johnson was like, hey, calm down. I got this. No need to worry. I'm going to eventually work my way to my feet, and at that point, Dumas is going to gas himself out, and that's where I'm going to get better success with my style of fighting. And that's exactly what happened. Johnson eventually worked back to his feet. Dumas started sucking wind, throwing crazy, weird, flashy strikes that was taking way too much energy. And then come the second round, we saw Johnson get that guillotine choke and quickly force the tap from Dumas. And it seemed like as soon as Johnson got his arm around Dumas's neck, Dumas was just ready to tap. And it was just a matter of Johnson finding the right angle to torque enough. And that's where we saw Dumas end up tapping out. But Johnson is a guy that normally brings his explosivity with his power and getting his opponents out of there quickly. That's how he was able to earn his contract with the Contender Series, by knocking his opponent out within the first minute and a half. And he's a fighter that, relies heavily on that athleticism and that explosivity to get a lot of his wins. That's why, the majority of his career he spent at heavyweight and light heavyweight, because of that speed and power that he can bring and, obviously get the better of his opponents that way. But he knew once he made it to the UFC, he wasn't going to be able to get away with that type of disadvantage in the size and length that he'd be going up against in terms of talent as well. So he cut down to middleweight, a cut that doesn't seem all that too hard for him. He was able to make the switch pretty quickly from his Contender Series fight being fought at heavyweight down to that middleweight debut in November. And I think this is the best division for him. But he's still yet to be tested against somebody that's going to be able to deal with that power early. Have a good enough cardio game to go into the second and third rounds and muzzle that power of Johnson. And maybe Cody Brundage is the guy. Cody Brundage, as much as people want to call him soft and flaky and all that, this guy doesn't say no to anybody, apparently. He's gone from fighting guys like Bo Nickel to Cam Roston to Eric McConaughey, Dalja Lungiambula from back in the day as well. This guy's fought the who's who at middleweight. Obviously not the guys that are in championship contention, but he'll take any and all challenges. But he's had, no contest to Abdul Razak Al Hassan. Then he got that crazy knockout in a war against Julian Marquez. Then he went to a draw against Mansour Abdul Malik. Then he lost that close split decision against Eric McConaughey. And then he got absolutely worked by Cam Roston back in January, where he eventually got TKO'd in the second round of that fight. Brundage comes from a wrestling background, and that's what he tried to assert a lot earlier on in his career, but now he kind of just brings the fire with the power that he has in his hands by marching his opponents down and trying to land big shots to get them out of there that way. There are times where he'll still try to sprinkle in the wrestling when he can, but it doesn't seem to be all that effective at this level. So as much as we want to rag on him about him being a little bit of a quitter at times, or a guy that probably doesn't deserve a UFC roster spot, you got to credit him for being able to take some of these short notice spots, like the one this weekend where he steps in for Duško Todorovic. I believe he came in on a short notice against Cam Roston as well. I could be off on that, but there have been multiple short notice spots where he stepped in and provided entertainment. He has fight of the night type performances, even if he comes out on the losing end. So he's willing to go in there and have wars, but if he can't have that success in the first round, it often seems to him, seems like he starts to fall off with his efficiency, and opponents are able to take over that way. Just as we saw in the Bo Nickel fight, right? Many people expected Bo Nickel to run over him in the first round, but he got Nickel into the second round and, made Nickel work for that finish, even though the finish eventually did come. Now, here against Dante Johnson, this is easily the toughest fight in Johnson's career. Say what you want about Brundage. Brundage won't go away easily from Johnson's explosivity and power. And that's kind of why I like the over 1.5 at plus 165 here. I think Brundage will try to make this a little bit grindy with his grappling and his wrestling. And I think we're going to see both these guys exchange some big shots. But once Johnson starts thwarting whatever Brundage does to him, I think we'll see Johnson start bringing that heat in the second round or the third round, and then eventually find the knockout there. But even at that point, you can't fade a guy like Brundage with minus 650 with a guy that's never been tested in the mixed martial arts world. Maybe Brundage can eat those big shots and throw big shots in return that Johnson hasn't eaten in the past. That's definitely something to consider here. So I would stay away from the minus 650 on Johnson. I'm not advising to lay the plus 475 on Brundage either, but the spot that I'm kind of leaning on is the over 1.5. I think we'll see a bit of a grind here early, and I think that'll eventually lead to a finish for Johnson in the second or third round. But I don't want to take that chalk. I'll be interested in what the round props look like for Johnson, but the over 1.5 is probably where I'll end up putting something down. But I like Johnson. I like him to win inside the distance, but over that 1.5 round mark. All right, moving over to the bantamweight division now. We got former champion Cody Garbrandt coming in at plus 125, going up against Xiao Long, who comes in at minus 145. Now, Cody Garbrandt came up short against Raoni Barcelos last time around in a fight where he started off pretty hot. He was sticking and moving well. We were seeing some glimpses of old Cody Garbrandt with how good his striking normally looks. But then it seemed like he hit a wall in the second round and Barcelos was able to take over completely. Garbrandt had the speed advantage, but it seemed like I don't know if it was his gas tank, the fact that he was constantly having to move backwards, but Barcelos really started to take over in the second and third rounds. And even though we still saw some good takedown defense from Garbrandt, he just couldn't get to his success with his striking game, and that ultimately led to him losing that fight on the scorecards. Prior to that, he got submitted by Davis and Figueiredo at UFC 300. And the only guys he's really beating are the Trevin Jones and the Brian Kelleher's of the world. He is now, what's the record? He is 3-7 in his last 10 fights. And that is after defeating Dominic Cruz for the bantamweight title in December of 2016. That was one of the best championship performances we had ever seen, and there was a high ceiling for the potential of Garbrandt. A guy that was marketable, a guy that was fun to watch, a guy that would provide nasty knockouts, but he just ran into a wall. He got knocked out in back-to-back fights against TJ Dillashaw. There's so many fights where he just ended up coming up short. I think the lone win that he had outside of the Kelleher and Jones fight was the knockout victory over Rafael Assunção, where he just kind of, juked him against the cage and landed that overhand right near the ending of the round. But he hasn't been able to show off that skill set all too often as of late. His chin has been a big liability. His cardio now seems to be a little bit of a liability, and he just doesn't seem to trust his chin anymore. And I think that's what's causing him to be more contained and a little bit more gun shy as we get into deeper water in fights. Now he's going up against Xiao Long, who may not be a big name, and a lot of people may be looking to fade this guy with a former champion, but he has a ton of experience. This is going to be his 38th professional fight, and this will be his third official UFC fight. Now, he came up short in the road to UFC finale against Chang Ho Lee in a very close split decision loss. That was a fight where you could just flip a coin and whoever won, you wouldn't be mad with it. A lot of jockeying for position in the grappling and clinch realm there between the two, and it seemed like they both had the same amount of success. Then Xiao Long eventually made his official UFC debut against Kwang Lee in a fight where he pretty much dictated the pace of the entire fight, walking Kwang Lee down, walking through Lee's flashy striking approach, landing big combinations, and eventually finding that third round finish. Unfortunately, he was unable to replicate that success against Su Young Yu last time out in another very close fight. I thought round one, you could probably give to, I think it was round one you give to Yu. Round three, you give to Long, who was really coming on and, putting Yu on his back foot, landing his big shots, mixing in nasty elbows as well inside the clinch. But it really came down to round two, which was a very close round, which could have gone either way. Long is a guy that loves to bring that aggressive striking approach. He utilizes his hand movements a lot to try to hide his attacks, try to hide some feints as well. And after that, he throws a lot of big strikes as well. He's only 27 years old, which is crazy to think that he's coming into his 38th professional fight. But when you come up on the Chinese mixed martial arts scene, you're able to fight a lot more often than you can in the North American side of things because the sanctions and suspensions are not as stringent over there as they are in the North American side or even the European world. But I think that experience has helped him. The strength of schedule on the regional scene, not the highest, but getting those reps in, constantly going out there and fighting these, some of the tougher guys, especially later on in his career, is helping him be a little bit more successful in the UFC. Now, I feel like this should be somewhat of an easy fight for Xiaolong. This can be competitive early. I will give Garbrandt credit for the speed advantage he'll probably hold early in this fight. He could definitely land some big shots and maybe find a knockout. But by all accounts, Long's durability has looked pretty damn good. Long has not been knocked out in over 9 years or nearly 9 years. And even then, I believe it was a TKO cut that got him that loss. But he's eaten some big shots in recent fights. He's been able to dictate the pace in a lot of fights. And I believe after a competitive first round, we're really going to see the Chinese fighters start to put it on Garbrandt. And I don't think that's where Garbrandt is all that comfortable. Being pushed back, I think we're going to see Garbrandt try to resort to some takedowns. I think Long's takedown defense is good enough to keep Garbrandt striking. And then from there, I think we just see Long start walking Garbrandt down. And I think that could even lead to a Long knockout victory, especially in deeper water. There are so many times where you can see Garbrandt looking up at the clock in the Barcelos fight, and I think that has to do with him just starting to slow down, starting to gas a little bit, and it's going to be hard for him to try to maintain his composure when he's fighting a guy as maniacal as Xiaolong. So he may not be the most famous guy. He may not be, have a great UFC record going 1-1 over his 2 official UFC matchups, but stylistically speaking, I think this is a bad matchup for Cody Garbrandt, a guy that I think is legitimately washed now. And I think we'll see that come to fruition here as Long knocks him out probably in the 2nd or 3rd round. All right, let's move over to a middleweight rematch now where we got Gregory Rodrigues coming in at -200 going up against Bruno Ferreira, who comes in at +170. Now, Rodrigues is looking to build upon his 2-fight winning streak, the last of which was a win over Roman Kopylov, a fight where he was able to pretty much dictate the majority of that fight with his striking game, showcasing that his durability is still pretty good. And he beat Kopylov in the striking game, which is where a lot of people believed Kopylov would get the better of Rodrigues. But when Rodrigues gets into his groove, manages the pace, dictates the pace, walks forward, throws his big combinations, and lands with the emphasis that he does, he usually muzzles his opponents pretty quickly. He is a BJJ black belt, and we've seen him mix it up in the grappling game when he needs to, but he can win solely off his striking if he needs to as well. His last loss came at the hands of Jared Cannonier last year, which was his, I believe it was his first UFC main event, and he had a hot start, but the veteran skills of Cannonier start to come through as he start to pressure Rodrigues and eventually finish Rodrigues in the 4th round of that matchup. But Rodrigues came storming back in his next matchup as he knocked out Jack Hermansson brutally in the 1st round of that matchup, and I think that's kind of brought his confidence back. Rodrigues is one of those guys that's had issues in terms of the longevity of his consistency. He'll go on and win 2, 3, 4 fights in a row, but then run into somebody like Jared Cannonier, even the loss that he suffered against Bruno Ferreira, who he rematches this weekend, it kind of stunts his growth a little bit. This guy could easily be in title contention had it not been for some of those hiccups that he has in his career. But I think those losses are making him a better fighter. I think if he could redo it against Jared Cannonier, he wouldn't come out so hot looking to take the veteran out of there so quickly. But he is still a solid fight IQ, good overall skills, has the grappling to stay safe if he needs to. But this is one of those fights where he's going to try to exercise his demons against Bruno Ferreira. Now, Ferreira came into that fight with Gregory Rodrigues on short notice, even though he earned his contract through the Contender Series just a few months before that. But he felt good enough to go in there against Rodrigues to try to snatch his momentum. And he did so. It was a competitive battle, but eventually Ferreira landed a counter left down the pipe that put Rodrigues clean out. And now since then, Ferreira has had some decent success. He did get knocked out by Nursultan Ruziboev in his following matchup, but he's been able to put together some solid wins. He's now on a 3-fight winning streak, 4-1 over his last 5 fights. He obviously has that submission loss to Abus Magomedov sprinkled in there as well. That was his first time ever going to the 3rd round out of however many fights he had at the time. And even last time around against Marvin Vettori, that was the first time he had ever hit the scorecards in 17 pro fights. And luckily for him, he was able to get his hand raised. We know about Vettori's legendary durability, and he was able to eat all the big shots from Ferreira. Ferreira did start to slow down in that 3rd round. That's where we saw Vettori have some success. But we know Vettori couldn't punch his way out of a wet paper bag, so we knew Ferreira probably wasn't going to get finished in deep water. If anything, it would have been from exhaustion, but Vettori wasn't providing enough resistance there or much of an offensive effort to cause Ferreira to quit. So we know Ferreira can go into deep water now, but I don't think he's going to be all that effective against somebody that can actually provide a threat to him, especially a finishing threat as well. Ferreira is a BJJ black belt, and we often see him look to get fights to the ground where he smashes through his opponent's guards and threatens with submissions or nasty ground and pound, that Hulk smash type ground and pound. And then on the feet, big winging hooks, big power shots that often put opponents away as well. He's a fun fighter. Very skilled fighter as well, and a very dangerous fighter. But I think this is one of those matchups here against Gregory Rodrigues where we see the fight play out how it probably should have played out in the first one. Now, this is the second fight in as many weeks where we see a rematch happen where the favorite in the first fight loses, but they still are a favorite in the rematch. And the fight that I'm talking about is Jocelyn Edwards against Nora Kernol. We saw Edwards lose a split decision against Kernol in their first fight. Obviously different from the result that happened in the Rodrigues and Ferreira fight. But then the second time around, Edwards left the judges out of it, got a nasty slam submission. It was like a slam to a submission finish that she was able to get over Kernol. And I expect a similar result to play out here for Rodrigues. Maybe not as violent, but I still expect him to eventually find a finish here against Ferreira. At minus 200, probably not. We know Ferreira is nasty with his power, and maybe we see a muzzle for Rodrigues because of the threat of that power. But I think Rodrigues will be a little bit more assertive in terms of establishing his jab, keeping Ferreira at the end of his punches, exaggerating that 4 to 5 inch height advantage that he has. He has a 3-inch reach advantage as well. I think we see Rodrigues play it a little bit safe through the first round and a half. And then as he senses Ferreira starting to slow down, that's where we see Rodrigues start throwing with big power. And I think that's where he ends up getting the knockout win. So I think this fight finishes inside the distance. I think Rodrigues wins, but I would think twice in terms of taking him at chalk. Maybe wait throughout fight week. Maybe we get a better line on Rodrigues once people start to see that, hey, Ferreira already knocked this guy out. Maybe people are going to want to back that plus money on Ferreira. So if we can get Rodrigues down to that minus 150-ish line, I feel a little bit more comfortable there. But as of right now at minus 200, I'm fine to just pass. But the prediction will still be Gregory Rodrigues by knockout. All right, moving over to the lightweight division now. We got a pick'em fight here between Drew Dober and Michael Johnson, 2 veterans of the UFC game. Now, I'll start off on the Dober side of things, who was able to snap a 3-fight losing streak after he knocked out Kyle Prepelic back in October. Now, Dober has been a guy that always brings the entertainment. He is a very violent and fun fighter. His last 8 wins have all come inside the distance, with his last win by decision coming in August of 2018. He's 37 years old, so he's definitely getting up there in age, maybe slowing a little bit, and maybe that's why he's getting finished more often than not in some of his fights. But he's also made some bonehead decisions inside the cage, most notably against Renato Moicano, where he engaged in the grappling, allowing Moicano an opening to get the fight into his realm and grind that fight out the way that he did. But Dober is most dangerous when he can let go with his strikes. He's fast, he's explosive, he's powerful. That's where he's often able to hurt his opponents and eventually get them out of there. But he is starting to slow down a little bit, right? We saw him struggle a little bit with Prepelic, specifically in the second round of that matchup. As we went into the third round, Dober hit Prepelic in the nuts pretty badly. It took Prepelic nearly 5 minutes to recover from that, thus forcing the referee to take a point away from Dober, and that seemingly lit a fire under Dober, knowing he probably needs a finish if he wants to walk out of Vancouver with a win, and that's exactly what he was able to muster up just a few seconds after the fight resumed. And that's what he leans on. but he often leaves himself vulnerable to getting countered and hit by his opponents as well. His grappling, mediocre at best. I'd say the best trait in his game, two things: his experience fighting, in the UFC for 10 plus years at this point in time, and his speed and power, especially early on in matchups. Now, he's going up against a nearly 40-year-old Michael Johnson, who has a little bit of a career resurgence going on. He's on a 3-fight winning streak, which is the first 3-fight winning streak he's been on in 11 years. That's crazy to think considering the amount of hype he had coming off The Ultimate Fighter. I believe he was the first pick on The Ultimate Fighter that season. Did a lot of good things, but really struggled from August of 2015 to May of 2023, where he went 5 of 11, and he also had 3 and 4 fight losing streaks sprinkled in there as well. But since 2024, he's turned things around. Majority of these wins against not as experienced opponents, showcasing that he can still be very dangerous. And even that win over Daniel Zellhuber, showcasing his speed and power to really hurt Zellhuber through the first 2 rounds and then do enough to survive that last round to win that fight on the scorecards. He's still good, right? Some of the losses in that run from 2015 to 2023, a couple fight IQ mistakes, right? A lot of those are fights that he's winning, and then he eventually either gets clipped or submitted, and then he ends up losing those fights. But when he is able to bat a perfect fight, you see the potential that he had when he was much younger in his career. I'd say the best parts of his game: his striking, fast hands, stinging power, good footwork, good range management. If his durability holds up, he's very hard to deal with in that aspect as well. And his defensive grappling is normally good enough to force opponents to strike with him more often than not. Now here with Drew Dober, fun fight. 2 veterans, 2 guys that we know that are more than likely not going to be able to fight for a title, or at least get close enough to a title shot or title contention, but it's still a fun fight based on how they fight. Dober could absolutely land a big shot to put Michael Johnson away early. But on the flip side, Johnson is the better technical fighter in my opinion. He's cleaner with his strikes. He can counter more effectively. I think he can counter the explosive movements of Dober and possibly find a knockout of his own. But I've always had issues in terms of trusting Michael Johnson's chin. With that said, with this fight being at a pick'em, I have to lean with Johnson, and I think you have to make him the slight favorite because of the technical advantages that he has in this fight. Look for him to utilize his handiwork to counter Dober, and I think he eventually lands that big shot to put Dober away. Thus, I'm going to go Michael Johnson by knockout. All right, that moves us over to the bantamweight division now, where we got veteran Rob Font coming in at plus 190, going up against Raul Rosas Jr., who comes in at minus 225. Now, starting off on the Font side of things, he had his 2-fight winning streak snapped last time out by David Martinez, which was a fight that took place in September. Now, we know Martinez obviously coming off a big win this past weekend over Chito Vera. That kid is streaking and really destined to get into title contention. But Rob Font, unfortunately for him, accepted Martinez on short notice after Rosas Jr. was forced out of that matchup. If you guys remember, Martinez was scheduled to fight Kwang Lee that night, but after Rosas pulled out, the UFC inserted Martinez into that spot against Font, and Font ends up taking a loss. But Font still has the chops to go out there and have some good success, right? Pulled off a big upset victory against Kyler Phillips, and then he was able to pull off that upset against Gene Matsumoto in a relatively close fight, but we saw Font have to lean on all of his mixed martial arts to get the win that night. At his best, he is a volume striker who sticks and moves very well, likes to utilize high output, high activity to chip away at his opponents from distance, but he can grapple if he needs to as well. Defensively speaking, kind of a bit of a liability depending on the type of fighter that he's going up against. If he has striking to worry about and then a guy that can grapple behind it like Corey Sandhagen did against him, that's where he kind of falls into a little bit of trouble. Same thing with Davison Figueiredo, who was able to have success there too. Font has crazy good durability, although he's been rocked and hurt in a few of his fights. He still manages to hold on and know where he's at so that he can survive those bad moments and then get back to his game as best as he can. He's also getting up there in age. So he's 38, which is really not the best age to be at bantamweight, but as he showed in the Kyler Phillips and Matsumoto fights, he can still pull off the win if he has a good enough stylistic match across from him. He's going up against a grappler here in Raul Rosas Jr., who is distancing himself from that April 2023 loss that he suffered at the hands of C-Rod Christian Rodrigues. He's on 4 straight fights now, finishing 2 of them against Terrence Mitchell and Ricky Turcios, but then he's been able to go to decisions against Arichi Lang and Vince Morales last time. Now, it's getting harder and harder for Rosas to get these wins, right? That's why he's not finishing these guys as of late. But he is so persistent with his grappling that it's hard for opponents to get away from him and get off on their own success. He's getting more comfortable in the striking game so he can throw some strikes and combinations before he eventually gets to that clinch position where he often does a great job of getting the back of his opponents, dragging them to the ground, and then just riding those positions out while threatening with the rear naked choke. But, he's still only 21 years old. He's still very, very young in terms of working into becoming a more complete mixed martial artist. And he's getting solid experience, right? There's no need to put a rocket ship to the back of this guy to try to get him into title contention. Just let him build into his confidence and build into his experience so that it can be more beneficial for him once he starts fighting the title contenders of the bantamweight division. But we know what he's best at, right? Getting opponents to the ground, smothering them, finding the submission, finding a TKO, and just getting his best work done that way. Now he's going up against Rob Font again. Stylistically, an intriguing one. Obviously, Font with the striking advantage, the crazy experience advantage as well against the phenom level grappling of Raul Rosas Jr. As much as I want to pick Font to win this fight, with him, just jabbing his way away from Rosas Jr. Rosas always finds a way to just somehow get a hold of his opponents and then get to that back position where he's able to work his opponents to the ground. And Font has been susceptible to guys that will constantly wrestle him and have good enough cardio to at least secure 2 rounds of control. And I think that's what Rosas Jr. will be successful with here. We are seeing Rob Font love come in, so that Rosas line is starting to go down a little bit. So unless he gets down to about minus 150 though, I kind of would rather just pass on this fight. I think we'll see Rosas Jr. get at least 2 out of 3 of the rounds here, get that control time, and I think that's going to cause Rob Font a ton of issues here. And I think it's, it might take a minute, it might take 2 minutes, it could even take 3 minutes. But I expect Rosas Jr. to get that control in the first, second, maybe even third rounds, and that should be enough for him to win a decision here. I don't hate the underdog shot on Rob Font at all. I get it. The angle is there. But I ultimately think that this is going to be one of those excruciating moments that if you're holding on to an underdog ticket on Rob Font, that he might be winning the first 2 minutes, but then gets taken down or gets his back taken and ends up having to fight Rosas Jr. off his back the entire time. So I'll go Rosas Jr. by decision, but I have no interest in taking him unless he gets closer to 60%, which is about minus 150. All right, moving over to the co-main event now. Middleweight's going added here as we have Kyle Borralho coming in at minus 275 going up against Renier de Ridder, who comes in at plus 235. Now, I was quite confident in Borralho as he went up against Nasruddin Imavov last September in a main event slot that would likely have produced a number 1 contender. Although I think Sean Strickland has kind of cut the line after his win over Anthony Fluffy Hernandez just a couple weeks ago. But regardless, Borralho ended up coming up short against Imavov. And I believe there was a couple of contributing factors. One of them being that just a few weeks prior to that fight against Imavov, Borralho was in Chicago cutting weight and made championship weight to be an alternate for the Dricus du Plessis and Khamzat Chimaev fight. I'm sure that did cut into his training camp and cut into his health a little bit, and I think that's why we didn't get to see him perform at his best against Imavov. Not to take anything away from Imavov. I thought Imavov did a great job in terms of asserting his striking dominance and really keeping Borralho at the end of his punches. Borralho really only had success, I believe, in the third round of that fight where he started to have some striking success, landing counters, utilizing the karate style that he's known for, but then Imavov picked it back up in the 4th and 5th rounds and was able to snatch the momentum back to get the decision win there. I did expect Borralho to grapple a little bit more. He did go 0-5 on takedowns, but I thought, we'd see him try to set up those takedowns a little bit better than he actually did. Now that snapped that crazy 16-fight winning streak that Borralho had, dating back to, I believe, his 3rd professional fight. And I think that's kind of brought him back down to earth a little bit. But I still think he's a guy that could potentially challenge for a title in the near future. I know he's 33 years old, but a couple more wins, a couple high-level wins could definitely assert himself back into that title contention. He's a very well-rounded fighter. He originally came into the UFC as a guy that a lot of people thought was just a boring grappler, would take opponents to the ground and smother them or try to find submissions. But, he outstruck Paul Craig. Obviously, he outstruck Jared Cannonier over 5 rounds. Didn't really have many issues in that fight outside of one instance, but he pretty much beat Cannonier on the feet through 25 minutes, showcasing that he is a well-rounded fighter. But fighting a striker of Imovov's level, that's where we kind of saw his ceiling in that aspect. But very good fight IQ. He's often been an analyst for LFA Brazil, flexing his mental muscles and all that. Obviously, one of the founders of the Fighting Nerds, which is a team that had some very solid success until a year or so ago. But he is a very knowledgeable and smart fighter. Now, he's going up against Reinier de Ridder, who a lot of people are surprised that he ended up fumbling the bag against Brendan Allen back in October. That night, de Ridder was originally scheduled to fight Anthony Fluffy Hernandez. Hernandez pulled out, and in stepped Brendan Allen as a pretty big underdog. But outside of some success in the first round from de Ridder, where he got Allen to the ground, threatened with a few submissions, Allen eventually turned the tide about 6 or 7 minutes into that fight and kept de Ridder on his back and just smashed him with some nasty ground and pound over the course of the next 2 rounds, and that ultimately led to de Ridder quitting on the stool before round 5. And that's kind of de Ridder, or at least what we saw from de Ridder at the ending of his ONE FC career. Anatoly Malikin, I believe the guy's name was, forced de Ridder to quit in the rematch, but also beat him pretty easily in the first matchup. De Ridder is a nasty BJJ specialist and definitely left his mark in the UFC after making his debut in November of 2024. He rattled off 4 straight wins in the span of 9 months, and then scheduled him for his second straight UFC main event 3 weeks short of his anniversary with the promotion. His win against Robert Whittaker was an eye-opener for me, as I thought that was a good fight for Whittaker to shut down de Ridder's grappling and force him to strike with him. But I think Whittaker's hesitancy in the striking game largely has to do with him kind of questioning his own durability. And that's where de Ridder was constantly able to move forward, land big shots, and eventually get to the grappling game when he needed it. But when he fought somebody that could handle him in the grappling realm and stay safe enough like Brendan Allen, that's where we saw de Ridder really start to struggle and eventually quit on the stool, just as he has in the past. Now here he goes up against Caio Borralho, a guy that I believe, similar to Brendan Allen, can stop de Ridder's advances in the grappling realm and force him to strike with him. And I think Borralho is a good enough striker to not allow de Ridder to command the respect there the way de Ridder did against Nickel and Whittaker. I think Borralho can counter him effectively, and I think he can just chip away at de Ridder. And I think those grappling exchanges could definitely eat some time off the clock, which leads me to believe this fight will hit the scorecards. But I think by the end of it, we will surely assert that Caio Borralho will come out on top, being the more effective striker, being the one landing more effective damage, and completely shutting down de Ridder's grappling game. So I'm going to go Borralho here, Borralho by decision, and I don't mind parlaying him at minus 275 either. And that brings us to the main event now, which goes down in the lightweight division, and it is for the BMF Championship, where we have Max Blessed Holloway coming in at minus 225, going up against Charles Do Bronx Oliveira, who comes in at plus 190. Now, Holloway is coming off of a decision win over Dustin Poirier, a fight which was also for the BMF title, but was also the retirement fight for Dustin Poirier, as he got to fight in his home state of Louisiana. Unfortunately, he couldn't have much success against Holloway, who had his number that night and finally got one over Dustin Poirier in their third fight together. But we know what Holloway's good at, right? Volume striking, good boxing, insane durability, outside of the fact that he got knocked out by Ilia Topuria, a guy that was able to knock out an elephant if he could. But Holloway, very skilled, still 34 years old, still in the prime of his career, a guy that is more than guaranteed to bring the fireworks and bring a fight of the night type experience to the live viewing crowd. And I think that's why the UFC has once again given him this opportunity. He's one of the most popular fighters on the roster, and he's obviously one of the more entertaining fighters as well. In terms of his defensive grappling game, we don't see it often get challenged. I believe Topuria had taken him down. There's been a couple fights where not a lot of guys have really been able to take him to the ground and hold him there. That's kind of the issue, right? We don't know what to expect with his defensive grappling game when he's going up against a heavy grappler or a guy that's going to be looking to attack with submissions as much as his opponent will this weekend. But by all accounts, his defensive grappling has looked good enough. He's often able to force opponents to strike with him. And even though he's not this crazy one-punch knockout specialist, he's still a guy that can go out there and beat you with 1,000 cuts. And that's kind of his approach more often than not. Now, he's going up against Charles do Bronx Oliveira, who is looking to build upon, I believe it was an October victory that he had over Mateusz Garbrandt, who came in on short notice for an injured Rafael Fiziev. That night, Charles Oliveira was able to halt all of Gamrot's grappling approaches and then just butcher him on the feet until he eventually got the back of Garbrandt and forced him to tap in the second round of that fight. That allowed Oliveira to bounce back after getting knocked out at the hands of Ilia Topuria in a vacant lightweight scrap, where Topuria was able to win the title by knocking Oliveira out in the first round of that fight. Now, Oliveira is one of those guys that really made a name for himself after COVID. Going into COVID or just before COVID, he was actually the last main event before COVID hit when he ended up submitting Kevin Lee. But, prior to that fight, he was seen as a guy that was an entertaining grappler, but a guy that would often quit. But he really made a name for himself during COVID, got to the point where he became the undisputed champion, beat some names that not many people expected him to beat, and he just showcased that his striking game was far evolved from what he had showcased earlier on in his career. Usually he just goes to his grappling, goes to his jiu-jitsu, and he's a guy that would often, secure those submissions and get finishes. He holds a few UFC records, including 21 UFC finishes. He has the most submission wins at 17. He has the most fight night bonuses as well at 21, and he is tied in second with the most UFC wins at 24. He used to be a guy that had said, when the going gets tough, he's going to quit. But he's no longer that guy. He is a guy that will bring it from minute one to, however long it takes. He's not a guy that often goes to the scorecards. So the fact that he went to his scorecards against both Arman Tsarukyan and Michael Chandler kind of goes to show that he can go into deep water if he needs to. But he is a guy that wants to implement his Muay Thai, his nasty kicks, get the fight into the grappling realm, and then eventually try to apply his submission game. This is such an intriguing and weird matchup, right? You got Holloway's finesse and his output-heavy boxing approach against the Muay Thai aggression of Oliveira and the BJJ approach that he brings. Quickly, obviously, we need to mention that this is a rematch of a fight that took place back in August of 2015, the only UFC event ever held in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan at the time, and it only lasted about a minute and a half. It was somewhat competitive or so, but it was clearly Holloway landing a little bit more effective damage. And then unfortunately, Oliveira suffered some sort of neck and shoulder injury after going for a takedown, and that halted the fight a minute and a half into it. So very weird circumstance there, but considering it's been over 10 years, these guys have built an amazing legacy for each other, for themselves. And now here they are throwing down once again past, their championship reigns. Very excited for it. Ultimately, I end up on the Max Holloway side of things. I feel like he should be able to stop the grappling of Oliveira. I think we'll see good submission defense for him when he inevitably finds himself in some compromising spots. And then he's going to start chipping away at Oliveira on the feet. I think for Oliveira to win, he needs to implement a kick-heavy game and try to slow Holloway down that way. And then maybe he can open up some takedown opportunities from there. But I think Holloway walks him down, keeps the jab in his face, starts landing some big shots. I think he hurts Oliveira a few times. But ultimately, I think Holloway eventually wins this fight on the scorecards after a competitive battle, which is why it's hard for me to get behind him at minus 225. I would put him closer to minus 150, given the danger that the dangers that Oliveira presents with the many ways that he could possibly finish this fight. Obviously, the biggest one being by submission, but I think Holloway will do a good enough job in terms of keeping this fight away from the grappling realm and eventually just walking Oliveira down, landing his output, landing his volume. He might be able to knock Oliveira out as well. It's absolutely possible. But I'm thinking with Oliveira initiating the grappling here and there, it's going to eat time off the clock, and that will lead to just Holloway outpointing him and winning this on the scorecards, and still BMF champion Max Blessed Holloway. All right, there is your full UFC 326 breakdown. Let's get into the recap for this past weekend before we wrap this bad boy up. I'll do my plugs after we do the recap, but we had a solid LFA 227. Now, on the graphic here, it shows plus 3.43 units. There is one fight that I did have some action on that BetMMA.tips did not post in time for me to be able to track it, but it should be plus 4.43 units, as I did cash on Ryan Ferreira at minus 150. I had enough to win 1 unit there. So, again, we cashed on our lock of the night play in Kyle Clark, who gets the first round. I believe it was a first round finish. We cashed on our dog of the night play in Rafael do Nascimento, who had an absolutely bloody affair with Shuya Kamikubo. We hit the over 1.5 in the Sheila Ladd and Isaiah Pinson fight, and then we lose out on the under 1.5 in the Roman Puga fight, as he ends up getting the finish about a minute or so after the 1.5 round mark. So I'm okay with taking that L, especially with how good of a night we had with LFA there. Unfortunately, we have to give most of it back with the next UFC event, which was the Mexico card. We still profit on the weekend, but the UFC card does end up being an L. We started off pretty well. We hit both of our parlays with David Martinez, Santiago Luna, and Francis Marshall. They cashed one parlay for us. Emmanuel Rodrigues and Javier Reyes cashed another parlay for us. The Reyes fight a little bit sketchier than I would have had hoped for it to be. Even the Rodrigues fight, he almost got finished. Both guys nearly getting finished, actually, now that I'm thinking about it, but still come back and get the finish themselves to help us cash that ticket. And then we did hit on Regina Tarin, who probably should have been the dog of the night play at the end of it, but we were already locked in with Macy Casson. And after a decent first round, she was unable to have any success in rounds 2 or 3, and that leads to her losing a decision. We lose on this one I'm very surprised that did not hit. Edgar Chairez and Felipe Bunez under 2.5. Very surprised that did not go, that went to the scorecards. That was very surprising. I think the first round being as stagnant as it was, with Bunez kind of just riding out that back position, that kind of ate into it, I guess. But I really expected a little bit more of a violent approach from Chairez, especially in the second and third rounds. He gets the win, but not under 2.5 rounds, so we have to rip up that ticket. And then the last one of the night was the lock of the night play with Brandon Moreno. Great game planning from Kavanaugh to chew up that lead leg of Moreno, but I really expected Moreno to set a little bit higher of a pace. I expected him to shoot better takedowns, not just try to hold Kavanaugh up against the cage, but actually look to land those takedowns and force Kavanaugh to work back to his feet, as that's where I thought Moreno's cardio advantage and his main event experience would have come into play. We saw him muzzle Kavanaugh a little bit up against the fence in that 3rd, 4th, and 5th round, but anytime Kavanaugh was able to get back into space, he was able to land that big calf kick, land a little bit more effective shots on the feet, and that ends up crumpling our lock of the night play there, with Kavanaugh pulling off the upset. So for UFC Mexico, we go minus 3.46 units. On the weekend, we're plus 1 unit when you consider LFA as well. But again, UFC is what you guys are here for, so I got to definitely have a better showing after these past 2 performances where we ate shit on UFC Houston, ate a little less shit on UFC Mexico, but starting off March now with the UFC 326, hopefully we can get off on the right foot here. This weekend, I believe, this weekend I'm only covering UFC 326. I will skim Octagon. I believe it's Octagon 80, Octagon 85. I will skim it. If there is anything I like on there, I'll throw a track play on the MMA LOT and Patreon page. So make sure you guys check that out if you haven't already. That's where I'm going to put all my plays up first, and all the other perks that come with it. So make sure you guys check that out. Otherwise, that's pretty much a wrap. A little bit later than I would like to have dropped this breakdown for you guys, but getting it out regardless. Appreciate the love, appreciate the support, and I will see you guys Tuesday at 8 p.m. Eastern for our live stream, taking all questions, comments, and concerns for this UFC 326 card and any other relevant news in the MMA world. Hope to see most of you guys there. See you guys then. Peace.
Last thing.